Jibril, thank you as well. That was a huge congratulations to you. It was a really, really inspirational start to the day, an amazing story, and I think testament to one of the biggest takeaways that many in this room will already have, and certainly I hope others will take away, which is that the importance of people who have direct lived experience. Thank you, Robin and Ben, for inviting me here today. And thank you all for coming. I want to start by acknowledging that there is tremendous expertise in this room, deep work that is being done, and that always makes it a little tricky to do a keynote. So really what I wanted to do today is to give a bit of scaffolding to the conversations that we may have to ensure that we can exchange ideas and expertise and hopefully continue to do more and more impactful work. And I want to do that by posing 3 questions, and I'll have a crack at answering some of them myself as well. So, first off, how does the current political context impact on how we support those with experiences of forced migration when we deliver programming? Right? Robin already started this conversation a little bit. Sport doesn't exist in a vacuum outside from the rest of society. The people that we are seeking to serve are impacted, and how does that affect our thinking strategically, from a funding perspective, how we talk about our programming and how we design it. So then moving on to what is the role of sport against that backdrop, and finally, what does good look like? And I want to offer you my best crack at some critical success factors. I'll give some examples of the work that my colleague Nick and I have done. We've been I think we visited over 50 different sports programs that seek to build better social inclusion, build social and emotional learning in people who have refugee and forced migrant experiences, both in the UK, wider Europe and the world. So we'll try and give you some practical examples and some takeaways from that. And as I say, then look at some programmatic critical success factors. How do we get it right? And I know this is scheduled for 40 minutes. It will not be 40 minutes. Please feel free to interrupt me at any stage, come up with suggestions. I love it when people disagree with me. It's my favorite thing, because then I get to learn from you, because I might be wrong. So please do feel free to do this. So, starting off with sport cannot operate in a vacuum. This is a topic close to my heart as a whole. If it wasn't for the UK offering a safe haven to my family, granted several generations ago, but both on my mother's and my father's side, I would not be here today, like many people in the UK. But domestically, the last decade has marked a really critical shift in how we respond and welcome people from towards a wariness and from a compassion towards suspicion. And that started really, if we look at the last 10 years, if we think back to 2014, 2015, what's often termed the Syrian refugee crisis, I prefer to call it a welcoming crisis. You will remember that harrowing image of the young 3-year-old boy who was washed up dead on a beach after he tried to find secure passage with his family. And that led initially to the UK Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. Limited in scope, but really quite important from a symbolic perspective. But that symbolism and that sympathy really quickly gave way to securitization. And we saw the hostile environments policies. Now, this started around 2012 under Theresa May, but was really deepened in 2015, 2016. And I think this is one of the most disgraceful attempts that we have seen in this country to strip people from their very, very basic human rights. The policy at its heart turned public services into border enforcers. So the NHS, schools, landlords, banks, all of the services that you need to live your life on a day-to-day basis, to be healthy, to get education, to have safety and security, were politicized and weaponized. And it had devastating effects on many, many people who came here because nowhere was safe, right? The insecurity that offered had a really long-standing impact on people. And of course, then we had Brexit, 2016, the rise of the kind of rhetoric around taking back control, linking that to migration, the loss of sovereignty, this conflation of EU borders and broader refugees and the sleight of hand that we saw there. And that really normalized an anti-immigration discourse in mainstream politics. 2018 saw the Windrush scandal. This is really where that hostile environment policy came to the fore, and we saw just how impractical and unethical many of the policies were. Despite living in the UK for decades, paying taxes, raising families, working, a whole generation of people were wrongly classified as undocumented migrants because of bureaucratic failings in the system, poor record keeping, and these new immigration laws that became increasingly complex. We also saw this real shift, and I think this is one of the most important pieces that we challenged, but there was this real shift towards stopping the pull factor, right? This idea that instead of being a safe haven for those who are fleeing conflict, environmental crisis, and persecution, that we should somehow offer deterrence. And the reason that I think that's so problematic, there are many reasons, but the main one is that it does not in any way acknowledge the push factors. The push factors that Britain has historically and continues to contribute to when we cause division and deprivation around the world. So where are we now? In the last couple of years, we've seen the Nationality and Borders Act, the Illegal Migration Act, tightening that net even further. It's created a two-tier immigration system, criminalizes irregular entry, strips people of citizenship, and has been denounced by many international human rights organizations as infringing our obligations at an international level in terms of the Refugee Convention. And we've seen people who are fleeing being labeled as lawbreakers with very limited opportunities to appeal. And as a result of that, the immigration system has almost ground to a halt. In the last year, calendar year that's on record, asylum appeals rose from just over 7,000 to 42,000. There's 42,000 people stuck in a system that doesn't function and that has ground to a halt. And the reason that this is so pernicious is that it is coupled with a rhetoric that we hear on our streets of our asylum hotels being full, millions being paid every day for these people who are here. When in practice, this is a system that has been fabricated by a government that has failed to legislate and manage a challenge that we should be up for. And of course, that's had major impact on the political discourse and stoked sensationalist media, harassment, protest, and violence. So, for people with refugee experiences, it's created legal limbo, increased hostility, destitution because they cannot access the basic services that in theory should be available to them because they have been politicized, a mental health crisis and isolation. For communities, there's a broken trust, a rising xenophobia and a polarization. And for sport, I would argue that it creates a risk that if we don't acknowledge this and somehow incorporate it into our programming and our discourse, we become complicit with these narratives and therefore ineffective. Oh yes, and then of course, the latest changes, extended residency periods for settlements, causing huge distress, disruption, and uncertainty, and then these increased language proficiency expectations, and that's what I think of that. So, let's think about what role we have. As Robin said, we all know, if you're here today, it's probably because you have experienced sport in a positive way. An immediate sense of belonging, a shared language, a place where your papers, your address, your postcode don't matter as much as your teamwork, your effort and your presence. And sport can be a sanctuary. It's a rare site of welcome where people can be seen as athletes and coaches and can contribute in that way. And that can be really transformative. But it's not a silver bullet. In all of our travels and all of our work, the biggest single mistake that we see is this expectation that without any intentionality, sport will automatically create a safe haven. And it doesn't, because in reality, sport mirrors society, and if society has problems, they will be reflected on the pitch and the field of play. And of course, Robin mentioned this as well, there are some intrinsic risks to sport. I'll talk later a little bit about a program that we designed for War Child, and there was real reluctance from the child protection and safeguarding team because a lot of what they saw, and this was a footballing program, at the time, just after, some of you will recall, there was a major abuse scandal in English men's football where decades of systemic sexual abuse had come to light as a result of the courageous efforts of many victims and survivors. And sport often has not only those connotations, but for those who don't have positive experiences themselves, they may not find that comfortable. It may be a place where they feel more excluded or limited. So I don't think that we can see sport, and I'll be mainly talking about football because that's where our experience mostly lies, as free of risk. Where I think it really comes into its own, and the programming that we saw that was particularly powerful, was around social and emotional learning. You have a definition there, actually it's an amalgamation of lots of different sources, but that's a good one. So it's the process of acquiring core competencies to recognize and manage emotions, set and achieve goals, appreciate the perspectives of others, establish and maintain positive relationships, make responsible decisions, and handle interpersonal situations constructively. This, of course, is not something that only people with refugee experiences need. It's something that we all need, that we maybe have all benefited from. But I'll go through why I think this is particularly important in contexts where we are dealing often with young people who have not had the benefit of consistent parental care, consistent teachers in the education system because they've moved around, or consistent access to other adult mentors in their lives to help them through those hard moments. You know, that time where you just can't get it right and someone puts their arm around you and goes, go on, keep trying, eventually it'll come, right? If you keep persevering, you'll get there in the end. That really at its core is where sport and social and emotional learning comes together. So, spotlight on football at its best. Global game brings us all together, shared love, common language, etc. We heard that earlier. And we looked at lots of different sports, I have to say. We did a big feasibility study in the UK, Germany, Greece, and France. We were asked to advise on what's the best sport for supporting people with refugee experiences. The answer is it depends entirely on what you're trying to achieve. And we saw amazing yoga practices, rugby, basketball, martial arts. But football was the one that was most popular. And there are some specific characteristics to football that I think make it particularly suitable to teaching social and emotional learning. And this is one of them, namely that it's a challenging technical sport, but if you're coached properly, competencies can grow measurably and quite quickly. And that's important because we worked with a child psychologist who taught me about this concept of islands of competence, right? For children and young people, it's really, really important that there is a place, a source of pride and accomplishment that can counteract feelings of inadequacy. And I think when you're constantly being bombarded with the rhetoric that we currently experience in the UK, having those islands of competency, having those measurable, tangible achievements that you go from one day, you know, really struggling to the next game, scoring a couple of goals or completing more passes or tackling more effectively, that can be really, really powerful. It's also packed with teachable moments. Anybody who plays football knows that decision-making is a big piece, right? Whether you pass the ball, receive the ball, dribble, try and beat someone. Every game has hundreds of individual micro decisions that you need to make, micro interactions with your teammates, opportunities to succeed and opportunities to fail. And through that, you can really evoke coping mechanisms in young people and those core emotional skills. And then this piece around manageable stress. Many of you will know this, but for those young people who have lived in conflict zones, who have navigated the perilous path from their home country to the UK, often facing abuse, exploitation, trafficking, grooming. We worked in Moria refugee camp in Lesbos in Greece, extensive recruitment of young people into organised crime, huge risk of sexual abuse. This creates toxic stress, which is effectively where you consistently live either at risk of serious harm. And it's incredibly detrimental. It has really, really bad long-term impacts emotionally, but also neurobiologically on young people. But not all stress is bad. In fact, we need stress in our life to have those stretch moments and to grow. And positive stress, when accompanied by really careful coaching, can really help people overcome obstacles and deal with hardships. And later today, we'll hear a little bit more about trauma-informed coaching. And I think that is another theme that I'd really like to impress on you from my perspective, that coach competencies and having really, really skilled and trained coaches, if you are working with groups who may have experienced trauma, is an absolute must. So, where did we see it go really well? This is a program called Midnight Football in Hamburg. All of the photographs either have individual people's permission. We've checked they either have that they're happy for it to be used and it is safe, or you won't see their faces. And I liked Midnight Football because it worked closely with the local population. For those of you who don't know the situation in Hamburg terribly well, this was back in, I think, 2016 or 17, we went there. Lots of young men, often unaccompanied minors or young adults who went ahead of their families to try and find a safe and secure place, test the waters, etc. And we spoke to some of them, we played football with some of them, and it was really interesting because their account was, we come from an environment where there are certain really clear rules and standards, right? You don't kiss in the street or hold hands if you're a same-sex couple or drink alcohol. And we came to Germany and none of those things seem to apply. So there are no rules. And of course there are rules, they're just unspoken. And so one of the biggest themes that came up when we were in Germany was how incredibly upset people got if you crossed on a red light. But nobody ever told them that, right? This was huge taboo, created all of this friction and tension in society. You had all these old white German people going, oh, he's crossing on a red light. Nobody told him that he couldn't do that, right? And the other thing, of course, was that on a Friday night, most young people, their peers in Germany would go out and have a drink, and suddenly they didn't have any parental control, there's no societal control. They were going out and having a drink, and as one can imagine, that also caused some problems. So this guy, Murat, set up Midnight Football because Friday night was the time when tension really came to a head, when people really struggled to cope with this adjustment from different societal restrictions to different societal freedoms, and created this space where they played football. There were things that could have been added to it that I would have loved to see, like a little bit more around safe spaces for conversations. Even in the time that we were there, we had a couple of conversations with young people that I would have loved to see referred onto other pathways, because I think they were really struggling. But the concept and the premise were really good. Many of you will know this. It's one of a number of programs in the UK. This is the Yorkshire St Pauli group, inspired by St Pauli in Germany. And I really like, I'm going to amalgamate this with a couple of other different programs in the UK, but there was a couple of things that we saw that I loved. So they set explicit standards and values. In fact, they co-created those standards on a regular basis. It was a mixed football session, and they co-created those standards as a collective where power was equally distributed regardless of your status, and they agreed on certain terms on how they play together. They thought really carefully about safety and equipment and making sure that there weren't those visible distinctions between people who were born and raised in Yorkshire and probably had means to football boots and shin pads and new kit, etc. So they thought about those barriers. They had a physio. These guys, one of the other teams, they had a physio on site, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but the reality is that if you don't know how to access healthcare, you all know the NHS is overloaded anyway. It takes a really long time to get a physio appointment. But if you're on your own, you don't have support systems, you have no alternative means, and if the NHS is being asked to police our borders, then getting injured, if you have experiences of forced displacement, are very, very different than if I get injured on a day-to-day basis. So I love the fact that they had that care baked in. And then finally, this program that I visited in Marseille in the south of France, and I flagged this because I know that this is about sport and leisure, combining sport with other activities every time seemed to have an impact that was greater than the sum of its parts. So this you can see, these guys have been playing football, and they went and they had a little bit of downtime, a little bit lower intensity sessions. This was an art therapist who worked with them, but I've seen it with mindfulness, I've seen it with other music-based programs. They seem to work really well. Don't know the exact science behind it, but they seem to work really well. People seem to stay longer, they seem to get deeper benefits from it. And anecdotally, I think it also helps participants to become coaches and then run the programs. Very, very, very few programs targeted girls and women, right? And I think that there's lots of reasons to this. These three young ballers were kicking around in Paris. It was a mixed session, and they just happened to be those girls who will run up, boot the boy in his shin, take the ball, and then turn and score. But that is not the most accessible form of football for most girls and women. And we run a football club here in London, has equal number of men's and women's teams. Building a women's program, even in London, is different than building a men's program. How we deliver, how we offer it, how we recruit, how we retain, how we engage with the players is different. But I'm a firm believer that if you build it, they will come. And the programs that intentionally took into consideration family and care responsibilities, for example, by providing childcare, made sure that the timings facilitated participation, make sure that the locations were accessible and safe, that if you had to travel later at night and it was dark, that there was good lighting or that you could travel together or that transportation was provided. In those programs, we saw girls and women thrive, develop extraordinary leadership skills, and take on big public-facing community roles that really change the dynamic between host communities and either refugee communities, people with refugee experiences, forced displacement, migrant communities more broadly. But for all of these good examples, we saw countless either ineffective programs, unsustainable programs, or unsafe programs. Here's some of the things that we saw. And I think for anybody who works in sport at an elite level or at a sport for development level, you'll recognise these. But I would argue that they are far more damaging in the context of seeking to include and welcome migrants. So we saw a programme being run by one of the foundations of one of the biggest clubs in Europe, where 5-year-olds were playing with 16-year-olds. Who wants to guess what happened in one of those sessions? Go on, someone give me a guess. What happens when you give a 16-year-old a ball and there's a 5-year-old standing there?
Someone cries.
That was the end result. How did we get there? Fortunately, he didn't get injured too badly. How do we think he got injured? He could, all of these things could have happened. 16-year-old obviously smacked the ball and booted him in the face, right? Because that's what 16-year-old boys do when you give them a football pitch and a ball, and they'll just smack it around, and this little 5-year-old standing there and go ahead. Fortunately, nothing happened. But that's really bad practice. And just because we're working with people who have recently arrived or who live in really difficult conditions doesn't mean that we can let those standards slip. It isn't safe. And just because we're doing it as a charitable endeavour rather than doing it in our academy does not mean that we can compromise. Girls not being allowed to play with the boys. Again, not unique to this type of work, but we have to recognise that there may be societal stigma, there may be cultural stigma, and that can go in lots of different ways, right? Can be within the community, can be a very understandable distrust of the safety of football coaches, of men, of other participants coming to a new country with your young daughter. How comfortable would you feel not knowing their standards, values and culture, of just chucking them into a football match? But I think if it's not modelled by coaches, if it's not picked up really consistently, it can deepen and entrench in some of those gender divides. Generally, we saw lots of really well-intentioned but bad coaching, right? In reality, poor behaviour in any young person, and I coach an adult semi-professional men's team, even among 25-year-old, 26-year-old men, poor behaviour is an effort to communicate, right? In all young people. And it's about trying to identify the source and the problems and treating that appropriately and proportionately, right? And we'll talk again later, you'll hear about trauma-informed approaches. Young people who experience trauma can react in what appears to be a disproportionate way, can act in a way that seems disrespectful to the coach, to other players, and in fact it is a trauma response. The worst thing you can do in those circumstances is punish them and be too disciplinarian. So it goes both ways with the coaching, and that's difficult. It's difficult to learn. And then finally, coaches who focused far too much on performance and not enough on effort, growth, and process. Again, not unique to this setup, happens in lots of different environments, but it's not the aim, right? The aim is not to create a whole bunch of ballers. The aim is to create a safe and inclusive space, grow social and emotional skills, whatever it is, you have to coach to that. And yes, you can use the teachable moments in football, passing drills, shooting drills, whatever it is, you can use that, but it's not the core aim. So finally, I'll run through these quickly. I just want to give you some critical success factors, what we can take away from this. It's been said before, programs led by lived experience, tested, tried, developed, and delivered by people with lived experience. Those are the ones that did best. A really clear commitment to the do no harm principle, whether that's based on your safeguarding experience, whether it's based on child-centered approaches. How many people are familiar with child-centered approaches? A little bit? Great, yeah. Basic principle is that you want to attribute age-appropriate agency to a child rather than just infantilizing them, right? In a nutshell. Robin, you can correct it later in your trauma-informed session. But that's the bottom line, is that there is a need to protect young people because their age makes them vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that you take away all of their agency. Multidisciplinary teams. We worked with child psychologists, we worked with emergency aid workers, with teachers, and there are frameworks outside of sport that we can and should use. We used, for example, the IRC, the International Rescue Committee's social and emotional learning competencies framework. It's really, really good. It's really tricky to attach to a football programming, but I think for those of you playing football later, my colleague Nick will be helping out delivering that session, and we'll be using some of the techniques from that. But we created a 20-week program twice a week working with young people who had experienced conflict, and just building up really consistently and consecutively, because the sequence matters, these core skills throughout the programming. Adequately targeted and scoped. What's your age group, gender, what's their competency level, what are they expecting, right? How good are they at the sport? Are they there because they all think they're going to be professional footballers, or they just want to kick ball and have fun? Talked a little bit about venue requirements for something that's logistically sound, the field of play, the facilities, the location, where you have really clear intentional programming. And you don't just tell yourself about the intentions of your program, you tell your participants, right? You're trying to develop leadership skills in young people. Tell them that today we're going to be looking at this. We're going to be creating lots of fun football drills that will give you the opportunity to practice, and you may fail, but that's fine, because then you're going to go again, you're going to pick it up, nobody gets it right the first time, and we go again. But what we're looking for today from all of you is to show that leadership. What do we mean by leadership? What's your brand of leadership? All of that. But be really intentional and clear about it. And I've talked a lot about coach competencies, time and time and time again. Even if you don't have the best curriculum, if you have amazing coaches who have those core skills, who understand trauma, who understand poor behavior, who can adjust and adapt when you were supposed to have 30 people in your session and you now have 14, or you were supposed to have 20 and you now have 40, where there are different time constraints, you need really, really good coaches, and that obviously has implications for programming and funding. So, I'm going to skip this because you're going to cover it later. This is one of my favorite models. Ask your coaches, do you know the 4 stages of psychological safety, and do you know how to create them in any sporting environment? Also really good for office environments, by the way. These are the 4. If you do not have these 4 attributes in any learning environment where people feel safe to be themselves, safe to ask questions, make mistakes, safe to contribute their ideas, and safe to challenge, it has a plethora of implications on and off the pitch. So, sport is only a good vehicle if we deliberately choose to use it that way. It is not a silver bullet, it is not a magical wand, but it has phenomenal potential. And for me today, reflecting on this when I was writing this speech, I think there's an important acknowledgement more broadly that this is not about charity and it is about solidarity, but not only about solidarity, it's about a recognition that if we get this right, it has a huge benefit to all. So I want to thank you all for being here today and showing your solidarity. I hope that today energizes you and that you learn from each other. I really look forward to learning from all of you, and that together we can work towards a more just and dynamic and connected sporting landscape that benefits the country as a whole. Thank you.